Hello and welcome to Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation with a change maker working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. We're going to do something a little bit different today. We're going to talk about a new partnership between Earth911 and Jump Digital, which recently developed a climate change training program for businesses in partnership with the Royal-Scottish-Geographical Society. Climate change is the most complicated and urgent challenge our species has ever faced. While there is plenty of evidence of the climate crisis in the news and in our neighborhoods, and billions of people are waking to the threat, most organizations and businesses are still trying to get their heads around how they can respond, change operations and their investments to end CO2 emissions, as well as prepare to adapt to the disruptions that will continue to become more dire until society succeeds in reaching carbon neutrality and begins to draw down the more than 1 trillion tons of anthropogenic CO2 emitted during the industrial era. Like I said, it's incredibly complicated. Our guest today is Michael Robinson, Chief Executive Officer of the Royal-Scottish-Geographical Society, which worked with Jump Digital to develop the Climate-Solutions-Accelerator, a video and training program that helps business understand the science and potential responses to global warming. It includes interactive quizzes that help reinforce the learning for your staff. And they've released the Climate Solutions Accelerator here in the United States through a partnership with Earth911. More than 60,000 people have taken this training, and it features globally renowned leaders, including former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, the late Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, and the former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson. And they present a clear, easy-to-understand introduction to climate science and policy, as well as the paths that we can take out of the crisis. We want to introduce you to Mike, the RSGS, and the Climate Solutions Accelerator's goals, and encourage you to consider purchasing access to the program for your management team and employees. It's available on Earth911 for $130, and we offer bulk discounts to make this critical information available to help business make the turn from carbon intensive to carbon positive. Welcome to the show, Michael. How are you doing today? It's good to have you back.
I'm very well, thank you much, and lovely to be here.
Well, I explained in our introduction that we're doing a partnership working with you and Jump Digital to distribute the Climate Solutions Accelerator. And I wanted to ask you about the program and how it was created. What will viewers learn about the impacts from climate change on their business and society, as well as to help them prepare to act?
So it came from a lot of conversations with business over the years. I used to sit on a government advisory group with a lot of senior business figures. And there's a growing awareness of the need to take action on climate change, but there actually is quite a lot of uncertainty in how to respond. Mm-hmm. And truthfully, because this is it was US scientists back in the 1970s that really first identified climate as a really critical issue. But it hasn't, it's not something that's permeated, everyday thought, and certainly hasn't been taught to most people in management positions now. So it was really important that we recognize that I realized a lot of people in business are time starved, they don't have lots of time. And so we just basically set out to make it as easy as possible to understand what you needed to know to be able to do something about it. I guess the principle I had was if you knew what I knew, you would want to do something about it. So we've structured the course to basically give you an outline in what are the key numbers that you need to know. You don't need to know all the science. You just need to understand enough and to trust it, really. The critical issue is that this is the direction of policy momentum globally. Mm-hmm. And what can you do about it? What are the solutions that we all know about?
So when you were talking with those organizations, what did you find the most common questions that business and other leaders were asking about climate change?
There was an obvious question around cost, but actually that was interesting because it was around more than cost. It was around risk, actually.
Right.
So people were concerned at the risk of both not acting and the cost of not doing something as much as they were to do with the cost of doing something and what the other benefits might be of taking action. So that was an obvious area. And I think people have increasingly realized that there's almost more risk in business as usual than there is in doing things differently and moving things forwards. And the next most obvious question really was, well, as a business, what can I actually do about it?
It's interesting. A lot of people criticize ESG reporting, but ESG actually forces you to look at those risks for the first time. And do you find that when folks have taken the CSA, folks, that's the Climate Solutions Accelerator. Sorry, we're speaking in the code that we've used as we talked about this. When people have used the CSA, do they then start to understand their organization's need to share that information in addition just to understand it? Because that seems to me to be the critical missing link, because we don't have a full view of our economy.
I think the answer is yes. I mean, we've sort of largely pitched it at managers and senior managers, but that's not everybody who's using it by any stretch of the imagination. But actually, one of the things that's important in a business is, first of all, I think we're trying to take any anxiety about learning about it. Businesses are in a difficult space because most of them know that they need to do something. Mm-hmm. But actually, a lot of them, when they start to do things, if they're not careful, they get more criticism than they get praise. And that's not actually helpful if you're trying to get people on a journey to change. So that it is really important. I think one of the areas that I think is really important is that the more people that know about this at every level of the business, the more ready they are to move that change forwards, and the more traction there is to actually bring that about.
So what kind of organizations are using the Climate Solutions Accelerator?
Well, truthfully, everybody. We've got a lot of public organizations, public bodies, but we've got a lot of big business. And what's interesting is that we've now started to see a very strong global demand for that. I think there's a recognition amongst many over recent years that this is getting more and more important. Mm-hmm. And so people are very, very keen to pick up as much learning as they can as quickly as possible. So it's all sorts of organizations. The biggest organizations we have are private businesses, construction firms, investment firms, all of these sorts of bodies. Particularly any business with an eye to the future.
So how would you describe where the CSA fits into the organizational learning process? And one of the insights that the folks at JUMP have shared with us is that it's sort of the 0 to 4 or 5 on the scale of 10 information that you need to just begin to orient and get started. So how do you recommend somebody apply this within their organization to start to orient everyone to where they need to think about going? So
first of all, we think it's the more universal it is, the better, because it is a basic level of understanding. We had a large writing team made up of some of the best scientists and academics I could get my hands on, along with business figures and others. And we're distilling 200 years of learning between us into 90 convenient minutes. So there is only so much that we can tell you, but it is a very, very good baseline from which to then work out, well, how does that apply to my business? How does that apply to me? And we certainly encourage people to think about it personally as well. So in the nature of the course, we are trying to say, which of these solutions do you think you can help deliver, or would you see as relevant to your business? It's not, I think one of the things that's really important actually in moving this forward is to both recognize that this is a complex issue. So there are complex solutions. There's lots of solutions. And rather than get stuck on the one that we don't agree on, let's get on and make the 10 that we do agree about happen. So a big part of this actually, and a big consequence of it, is actually behavior change. It is about getting people to realize that things are possible and help them to understand which way to channel that effort.
Well, one of the things I really liked about the CSA is that it gives you clear next steps without being prescriptive. You must do these things. Rather, it says these are the range of options that you have, and they have various impacts. Then, of course, you have to begin to start to understand those paths more specifically. How is the Royal Geographical Society thinking about continuing to evolve the program and potentially even more specialized follow-on programming around this?
Well, the main thing we are looking at, we realize we've had a lot of people undertake the course. It's close to 100,000 people have taken the course now. And what we're getting is a lot of requests to help inform the next step of the process. Mm-hmm. So to me, it is a journey we're all on. And for many people, this is the first step or maybe the second step for them, but certainly early days. So there's a real interest in actually getting a little bit of help. And what we're doing is working with organizations to help them to do that next step. And there are 3 different aspects to that. The first is making it more sectorally specific to them, mm-hmm. or to either to their business or the sector they operate in. The other one actually is just around guiding them to within their department, so within the actual the nature of the role that they might have. So that might be a fleet and transport manager or something, in which case it's a more topic-specific assistance, really. So that's another area. And then the other one we are actually talking to a number about is also rolling it out to supply chains. So a lot of businesses now recognizing the responsibility to operate in this space also recognize the impact that it has, potentially positive and negative, on their supply chains and their customers. So you're starting to see that vertical integration as well.
Well, and there's that both greater social and historical context that I think this course exists within that's important to call out. And I want to ask you specifically about, what did you think of the results of COP27? You're in Glasgow, which of course was the host city for COP26. Did we see progress this year? What was your takeaway?
In COP27, we didn't see a lot of progress, although actually it is a very difficult process, as you know. I was at COP26, that's not surprising, in Glasgow. And I think all governments know that they need to act. But of course, the problem with a very large gathering of all the world's governments is you can only go as quickly as the slowest participant. One of the things that has begun to happen more and more is those nations that are very reluctant or not interested in climate really, and not really taking it seriously, like Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, are increasingly being isolated internationally. Mm-hmm. And they will begin to find it, I think, much, much more difficult to trade as time goes on. But there's a lot of progressive nations, those countries that are trying to deal with this, are very keen to form alliances and learn from each other. And I think Scotland and UK have always been, massive friends of the US, of North America, Canada, and Australia. And I think we're really keen to sort of share any learning that we've undergone. We've obviously been trying to take responsibility for climate for some years and had some success. And I think we're really, really keen to help our friends and allies to do the same. So I think these sort of alliances are forming in a way that I think we'll see big dividends really going forward. But I think the single biggest change between the COPs is that the governments are starting to be behind the curve of the private sector.
Yeah.
A lot of businesses have made net zero pledges. They're not always sure how to achieve them. Mm-hmm. So we've got to ensure they're credible and deliverable. And that starts with learning.
Well, and a lot of those businesses are the largest companies in the world, which of course are hugely impactful, but many, many, many small businesses are still sitting on the sidelines trying to figure this out. Can you share with those folks who may be sitting and thinking about potentially getting involved in learning more, what would happen if we don't act?
Well, I mean, if we don't act, there's, it's not good news, is it? Let's be honest. I think we all know that. Every single 0.01 degrees Fahrenheit that we add to global temperature makes a difference. And the more we allow it to creep up, the greater the risk. It's all about risk management in my mind. And most businesses will completely understand that. So every time we're allowing the thermometer to go up a bit further, the risk increases exponentially. And there's a point at which it's going to be beyond us to control. Nobody wants to get to that point, which is why every single one of the world's governments meets every single year and ratchets up what it's trying to do for climate change, and will continue to do so.
Do you feel, though, that the political process, which is necessarily slow, it's designed that way, is going to be able to keep up with the demand to keep heating under 1.5 degrees Celsius? Or do you feel like, and I kind of came away from reading about COP27 feeling like we decided that's we're going to miss. Where do you think we're going?
Well, at the moment, we're not going to 1.5 or 2 degrees C. We're well over 3. It's a really difficult one to answer positively. 1.5 degrees, which was recognized as a safer threshold than 2, let's be honest, neither of them is safe,
right.
Was identified very strongly in Paris back in 2016. Even when that was written down, I worked with a number of scientists who believed that was optimistic back then. So 1.5 is difficult. A lot of the numbers that you see in climate science are predicated on 2 degrees C, on a higher rise. But that obviously comes with huge risks. And so, as I say, it's all about risk management. And we need to keep the temperature as low as we can physically keep it, this temperature increase, because, as I say, it's just every single bit of it adds complications, adds problems. You know, if we lose the coral reefs, we lose the schools that create most of the fish in the oceans. You know, there's a lot of issues that we really, really want to avoid. So the pressure's there to keep it down. The lower we can get it, the better. Most Western nations are going to have to go beyond net zero anyway. The net zero itself is a good aspiration overall, but we actually need to get to a point where we can probably remove carbon from the atmosphere if we're really going to avoid some of this. So there's plenty of work to do.
Well, with that sobering thought, let's take a quick commercial break and we'll be right back. We're back to continue the conversation with Michael Robinson, Chief Executive Officer of the Royal-Scottish-Geographical Society. We're talking about the Climate Solutions Accelerator. Mike, Earth911 is going to be participating next month at the University of Colorado's Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit. And in fact, former Irish President Mary Robinson is going to be speaking, one of your co-authors. Are these kinds of regional climate programs the next necessary step to create locally relevant and impactful programs? How do we take all these learnings and put them to work regionally?
Well, they're absolutely critical. The really most important thing in all of this is that we are all pulling in the same direction. So it's vital that we have an overarching solutions framework, but then having presented what the solutions are globally and nationally, it's vital that people then distill that down to, well, what's relevant in our regional situation, as much as it is what's relevant in our own organization and our own lives. There are choices. There are lots of things that we need to do and lots of things that can be done, but not everybody can do everything. So it's really important that we are following a framework, because with the best will in the world, if we don't draw regional plans from national plans, from global plans, then we're in danger of creating little whirlwinds of activity that don't actually add to each other. They don't build momentum in the right direction. So as long as we're all following a solutions framework, then that idea of creating regional strategies is vital. Brilliant step and really essential in moving forward.
Well, and that variety of the options we have apply differently in different regions. And so, some regions I think are going to be more focused on adaptation, whereas others will be focused on preservation of our current climate. When you think about what the CSA is designed to do and where you want to take it, for instance, in the next edition, which you guys are working to prepare right now, how do you think about articulating the fact that we're not speaking of a regimented future in which we all have to do X, Y, and Z in a certain order, but that we choose our order and we do these things in culturally relevant ways?
First of all, I mean, there are a number of elements to the course that I think have resonated with people. The fact that it's sort of factual and helpful and presents that range of solutions is really critical. It's not judgmental. And that's been very favorably received by people. People need the headspace to work out some of this on their own. There's no good shouting at them or forcing them into a corner. So that it is really important that you give people that room, I think, to make decisions on their own. But as I say, within that framework.
Now, the other thing that I think business needs to understand, and that the CSA does a good job of conveying, is that ultimately climate responsibility is going to be table stakes for doing business in the future. And getting there is a choice of strategy. What kinds of information should businesses be prepared to collect and share in order to create the dialogue that allows us to optimize our society in such a way that it becomes sustainable? Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the first thing is this idea that it's a table stakes, as you described. That's already actually in process. Businesses are already, rolling out these requirements on supply chains, and all the way through their business operations. And you're starting to find, in Europe at least, restrictions on being able to tender for work if you can't supply a certain amount of information and evidence on your carbon impact or your lifetime emissions. So that's already happening. And I think you're only going to see that more and more and more. So there's a point at which businesses actually are going to struggle to trade if they're not actually woken up to this arena and understand the requirements. The other thing around this is really, what sorts of information. There's already requirements to look at different types of emissions within your business, not just in terms of your own direct operation, the electricity that you use, but in terms of the indirect consequences of what you're doing as well. And there's also a move towards lifetime analysis of, well, what impact does this have in a life term? The other thing I think, though, that is going to start to creep in more and more is needing to evidence what efforts you're making to reduce your emissions. So that proof of effort. And one example of that is going to be how much have you actually cut your energy use or made your energy use, sustainable, and how much, for example, have you just offset? Because whilst offsetting has its place, it should be the last last resort, not the first resort. And sometimes we're using that in the wrong way. So we've got to cut back and be more efficient first. And I think the credibility of how businesses respond in this space is going to increasingly become more and more difficult for them. So.
Well, what we're really approaching here is this area of the question is the role of a company in the future. And if capitalism or free enterprise, however you want to describe it, wants to continue to prosper, it's going to need to do it in a different context, one that is certainly, speaking from a U.S. perspective, being actively debated. How do you see the role of business changing with regard to transparency, social accountability, and climate progress as you look, say, out towards 2030? What do we need to be thinking of as business leaders as priorities for change?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing is I know there's still plenty of skepticism around climate change in the US. But I don't actually think it matters if people believe in it individually anymore. The reality is that every government in the world does. Most scientists do. Most businesses do. This is actually the future of trade, the future of resources, the future of, how we design places and how we live. This is already there. It's not optional. It's already there, and it's increasing in its intensity. So that argument that it's maybe somehow optional or ignorable is just that is just going to completely dissipate over time.
Yeah, we agree.
But of course, what it really also does is I think it's going to also increasingly affect the bottom line for any business, because in the past, things that were seen as perfectly reasonable aren't anymore. And that's true in lots of social situations, but it's particularly true in our treatment of the environment. It isn't okay to pollute a river. It isn't okay to pollute a forest and think that there's no consequence. And it isn't okay to keep pumping, carbon emissions into the atmosphere, because there are consequences to these things. And where there are consequences, eventually people are going to start looking for blame. And that's not a healthy space to be in. We need to be putting all our efforts into moving away from that. I like to think that we simply know better. Climate change, to some degree, is the accidental consequence of being unsustainable. And I think until the 1980s, we just didn't appreciate how important that was. We thought we could keep producing because resources would never run out. And I think we now know that that's not true. So not unsurprisingly, we need to change the way that we think about our economy and our businesses and the way that we operate. So the idea of being able to cause pollution in some way, to poison a river, or even indirectly to cause wildfires and floods, that's not acceptable, and it's going to be increasingly so. So one way or another, this is going to affect the bottom line.
Well, I think you're also hitting on an important point that this is a competitive advantage. If you can embrace this and begin to practice these ways of doing business that are sustainable, you also set yourself and potentially your nation apart. And when I look at the EU, I see them beginning to separate from the rest of us as leaders in order to lead the world towards that next economy. I mean, if you look just at interest in engaging Dutch water engineers all over the world, the Netherlands has a potentially vast economy in the future because of its forward thinking. But on the other hand, progress on climate's been pretty discouraging. You know, we've got these record greenhouse gas emissions this year. The cost of damage caused by climate change between 1993 and today was between $5 trillion and $29 trillion to the losses and risk you were talking about before. And half of Pakistan was flooded this year. So when you are asked to respond to the question, do you have hope that we can act to avoid the worst of climate change? What is your answer today?
Ironically, that is a question we posed in a film we made last year about Scotland's climate journey. We were asking exactly that. Scotland has shown quite a lot of leadership in this, as has the UK. And that has already actually, as you say, led to the opportunities. It's not all negative at all. One of the things that's very obvious from the COP is that the whole world is realizing it needs to move in this direction. Even Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran have net zero targets as a nations. Mm-hmm. Everybody does. And we're all trying to make them more and more stringent. So actually, we need to know what's going on at the front of that, the countries that are leading that charge. We need to learn from them and share that learning as openly as we can. But I think actually it's much broader than that. There are also opportunities in this because there's what we're talking about also is risk of investment and risks around innovation. If we're clear what the solutions are, we know where we need to innovate. And so actually, when you look at some of the innovations, even in things like battery technology of the last 40, 50 years, because we now recognize the need for innovation in battery technology, suddenly all of the greatest minds start sweeping into that arena. And all of a sudden, we start to see progress. Yeah. And I think actually what businesses need, almost more than anything else, is certainty. Where do you invest? Where do you innovate? Where is the future going? The irony of sitting on this business leaders forum was I slowly realized over time that I could read the future because they hadn't read anything on climate change. And I knew that coal was going to be a problem, that electric vehicles were going to become an increasing part of our landscapes. All of these solutions that had been sitting for a long, long time, because I knew them, I could understand that direction of travel. And it was really brought home to me talking to an international investment conference. They were saying that there were trillions of dollars that had been disinvested internationally, but they weren't sure where to invest them. And they were looking for that certainty. And they were caught out by the demise of coal as an investment opportunity. That has gone from a safe investment 5-6 years ago to uninvestable, in their words, in the space of 2 or 3 years. It's uninvestable. They were surprised by that. Whereas I realized I could have told them that 15, 20 years ago. So I was quite surprised they were surprised. But I think that's why it's really important that people wake up to this, because it is, where do you want people to invest? Where do you want people to innovate? This helps answer that.
Well, to some extent, as you said earlier, this problem is a symptom of the times we live in. And in another way, we are prepared to deal with it because of the progress we've already made. Now we have to optimize the system we have. But a lot of business, particularly in smaller and medium-sized business, The question is of priorities and whether we can take the time to address climate today. So do you have advice for people who may be trying to get their employer, whether that's private enterprise or in business or in government, to engage with climate issues? What do you recommend they do to get that dialogue started?
Well, the first is to be confident in what they know, because as far as I can tell, they actually can tell the future, same as me. And what we have seen is an incredible growth in the need for sustainability teams and individuals in businesses. Now, the danger in a sustainability manager is sometimes they're left to try and get on with it on their own. But what we have seen more and more and more, and it's also a consequence of people doing the course, it has brought more and more people around the issue. And the sustainability team has gone from one person to 10 people to a board director with a responsibility. And so it goes on. Don't despair. This is the direction of travel. Not everybody realizes it and not everybody wants it to be the direction, but it isn't optional. It's there whether we like it or not. So change the things you can change. Focus on the things you can change in the first instance. But the other thing I think is really important that I've learned over the years is, and it's partly for my own sanity, is to focus on the solutions, because that is the positive conversation. If you can focus on what you can do and you can bring people around you and help them understand the things that need to be done, that's a very positive conversation. If you're just going to sit and make them fearful, I think you're going to put a lot of them off, and you're not going to get the reaction that you want. So try to remain positive, change the things you can, and focus on solutions.
Yeah, emphasize that it's a competitive advantage. Mike, can you tell us a little more about the Royal-Scottish-Geographical Society? You're an educational nonprofit. How can people learn more and get involved?
Yep, we've been around a long time. We're 138 years old, set up by David Livingstone's eldest daughter, and we've been educating people for generations, and involved with many of the great names in exploration and science over the years, which is how we managed to bring and persuade people like Mary Robinson and the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, to contribute to the course. But if anybody'd like to find more out about us, please look at our website. It's www.rsgs.org.
Mike, I want to thank you very much for taking time to talk with us today. And I hope that together we can get this message out to hundreds of thousands of more people.
Me too, Mitch, and it's a pleasure. Thank you.
We've been speaking with the Royal Scottish Geographical Society's Michael Robinson about the Climate Solutions Accelerator program. You can learn more about the accelerator at Earth911.com. Look for the Learning tab in the main menu to see a short excerpt and summary of the program. You know, we live in a world of limited resources, but there really is no limit on innovation, on making more of everything we have instead of wastefully using and disposing of products and packaging, polluting waters, soils, and the air, and logging forests for short-term gain. The trick of sustainability, if there is one, is learning to think like part of nature. How do we build a society that reuses everything just as nature does? What does an organization that, in addition to delivering a product or service, mimics the role of fungus and bacteria in nature, breaking down materials and all the raw materials that we have used to make those products and services for reuse? The ideas in the Climate Solutions Accelerator can help you, your colleagues, and your neighbors take critical steps toward a sustainable world. So please take a few minutes to check it out at Earth911.com. And I also hope you'll take a few minutes to share this show with your friends, family, neighbors, and coworkers. You all, folks, are the amplifier that spreads the ideas that we collect here on sustainability in your ear. Please let folks know that you can find the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, and all the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness that you may choose to use. We will really appreciate your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. We'll be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.